It's a great honor to welcome once again to this program Mark Moya of Hillsdale College. He serves as the chair of military history there. And today we're discussing his new book, Masters of Corruption: How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency. Mark, welcome to the show once again. How are you?
Hi, good to be here.
Okay, so let's just jump into your thoughts on the recent Trump trial and conviction. Do you find that to be a manifestation of the bureaucratic corruption that you've documented in the book?
Yeah, well, it's part of a system of what you could call weaponization, and also what we are seeing as the two-tiered justice system, which is essentially that you have different standards for people based on their political viewpoint, which is, I think, certainly something that is anathema to the American tradition. It's something we tend to see in despotic countries. And in the case of the Trump conviction, uh, I don't think anyone would probably argue that the president is simply above the law, but to charge somebody for some uh, minor infraction that has never been prosecuted before, right before an election, that to most Americans that seems politicized. And we've seen Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden have done things of a more serious nature that weren't prosecuted. So I do think this is part of a disturbing pattern, and that was something that, in my own case, was an issue because I was accused of publishing classified information and fired based on unsubstantiated charges, whereas we have Democrats like Colin Kahl and Jake Sullivan, who are engaged in more serious behavior, don't get prosecuted. So it is, I think, disturbing that we see this selective use of the instruments of justice.
Mhm. Well, I suppose if we are fair to the other side, the Democrats, Joe Biden's son, Hunter, recently was convicted as well. So I suppose whatever justice system that you guys have going on there, it seems to punish both sides.
Well, to some extent, they first tried to arrange this sweetheart deal where Hunter would get away with a minor infraction. It was only the judge who stepped in to obstruct that. We also still have a tax case with Hunter Biden coming up. So there are limits to it. And of course, some of these limits were established by our founders to try to prevent this sort of thing from happening. And constitutional protections certainly sometimes play a role. Now, in my case, and I think we've saw that in the Trump conviction too, that people have circumvented the Fifth Amendment's right to due process in some cases. And so there should be means of recourse. I mean, Trump will have an appeal. I'm still in court 5 years later suing the government to try to get them to comply with due process requirements. So, fortunately, we're not in North Korea or Vietnam for that matter, where you don't have these kind of rights, and it's much easier for people in authority to selectively or incorrectly apply justice.
I see. So, yes, I'd like to hear more about your case in regards to the publication of classified materials accusation.
Yeah, so I talk about this at length in the book. Essentially, I had served in the U.S. government before writing this book. The book was called Oppose Any Foe, published in 2017. So I had had a high-level security clearance, and they require you to submit works with for a period of 30 working days, so they can review them and see if they think they contain any classified information. Now, I didn't think the book did contain any classified information, but I did submit it after I received a sort of a warning from Special Operations Command, and they had been seen some recent books where people had actually published classified information. So I gave it to them, and when I did that, I realized they had actually prolonged this review period to 30 to 60 working days. Now, that's not in the non-disclosure agreement I signed, but when 30 working days came, they said, well, we're still working on it. So I said, all right, well, I still have some time. So I said, okay, fine, 60 working days. But then we get to 60 working days and still nothing. They're saying they're still too busy. And this goes on for a period of 7 months without anything happening, which is an abuse really of censorship powers. You're supposed to have a fixed time limit, and the Supreme Court has said this. So at that point, I invoked something from a federal regulation, which says that if you disagree with what they're doing, you can give them 30 days notice that you're going to publish, and they have in that time the ability to file a court case. So I notified them that they still didn't do anything. Another 5 months go by and no word. So after a year after I submitted it to them, I went ahead and published it, and nobody complained, nobody did anything for more than 2 years. So, if you actually publish classified information, that's the kind of thing where they will come after you the next day and raid your house. If you look at Reality Winner, for example, that's what happened to her. So they didn't do any of that to me. And it only came up after I had reported corruption, and I was back in the US government. I reported several career officials for acts of corruption, one of whom ended up getting forced out of the agency. And somebody else then, who I'm pretty sure was linked to this individual, sent a claim in that I had published classified information in the book that came out more than 2 years ago. So they suspended my security clearance and did an investigation. As I show in the book, they're supposed to offer you an opportunity to reply to whatever the charges are, but when they interviewed me, they said, well, we actually haven't received any substantiating evidence on this yet. And then at the end of the investigation, what they normally do is they either clear you or say you're guilty and we're going to revoke your clearance. And in that case, they have to turn over any and all evidence they have. But instead, they fired me and they circumvented due process. So then to make a long story short, they gave me a clearance back again a year later, even though supposedly I'd done this. And then they came after me again, but then again refused to turn over the evidence. So that's why more than 2 years ago, I sued them in federal district court to say they have to comply with their own rules that say that they're supposed to provide this evidence, clear abuse of government power. And the government tried to make claims that the court didn't have jurisdiction or couldn't do this. And the first judge sided with them, but then just a couple of weeks ago, the appellate court said, no, actually, the government and that other judge were wrong. And so it's being sent back to the lower court. But needless to say, it's been over 5 years to get what supposed evidence there was against me. Of course, I think the reason they fought so hard to resist this is that they know whatever their supposed evidence is not going to stand scrutiny.
I see. And you've recounted this in the beginning of the book too. And you've implied that the reason why there's such a bureaucratic legal measures against you is because of your involvement in the Trump administration. So why don't you elaborate more on that?
Yes, well, some of it is certainly politically motivated. And you also, as I point out, the bureaucracy will go after people of any stripe sometimes if they report it for bad behavior. And to actually cite a case of a woman named Robin Mercado, who's a liberal Democrat, and USAID Office of Inspector General actually went after her. But in my case, you had a combination of things. You had a career bureaucrat named Rob Jenkins, who was vying for this leadership position that was normally for a political appointee, which was me. And so he had this interest in trying to push me out. He also, another thing I did besides reporting corruption was that I reported that some of the career bureaucrats were deliberately trying to stymie the White House and thwart White House policies, which is a high degree of insubordination, which they should have been doing, because the career bureaucrats are supposed to be doing what the White House tells them to do. But you had a president who was very unpopular with most of the career bureaucracy. So you have that at play. You also do, as I point out, there are some of the Trump appointees actually were not there to support the president's agenda. And so the final decision that's made to fire me is actually made by a political appointee whose name is Bonnie Glick. And she, in her case, it was not so much political ideology, but think, her own conflict of interest. So it turned out, and I didn't find this out till later, she was married to the top lobbyist for our agency's contractors, which is something that never should have been permitted to happen. So it's not certainly a single factor, but you do have the problem is heightened in the Trump administration because of the fact that so many of the bureaucrats oppose Trump. And according to The Hill, 95% of the contributions from federal employees in the 2016 election went to Hillary Clinton. So that, in fact, in itself tells you something. Now, I should say, I worked with these career bureaucrats, and a lot of them are good, patriotic Americans. And so it's not that they're all trying to resist, but there was a sizable element in my agency and at quite a few other agencies who felt that it was their duty and even prerogative to try to substitute their own policies for what the White House wanted to do.
Yes. Truth be told, I've experienced much of this, I guess, bureaucratic madness in my own years as a university student. Perhaps not to the extent that you have, but the way I see it, the modern bureaucracy was built with the intent of providing a sort of politically or morally neutral framework in order to get certain procedures done. But it doesn't account for the fact that the people who work there, they have political agendas of their own, and they would like to see it enacted. And in many, many cases, their enactment of their political agendas, whether left or right, for that matter, are not being questioned or held to account. And that, I think, interferes with, I guess, public policy making, and in my case, actually, I guess, pursuing decent scholarship.
Yes, well, bureaucracies in the U.S. government, our current system goes back to the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which was enacted in the 1880s. And people thought at the time that this was a good idea to have a more permanent bureaucratic structure, because what had been happening was that each time a new party came in, they would sweep out everybody. And so then you'd show up and you'd have nobody who knew how to run the post office or handle the treasury. So they wanted people who had a longer presence in the bureaucracy. And there was, as you indicate initially, this idea that these people were actually going to be, completely neutral and impartial, and they were going to be experts. And this this mentality reaches its apex with Woodrow Wilson and his version of the progressive movement that essentially wants to take away power from the legislature, because those ignorant people don't really know anything, and give more power to these experts who, again, people think are these selfless bureaucrats who can do no wrong. But it was America's founders saw the danger in this, because they knew that people in general are fallible, and you don't want to give too much power to anybody. And so that's why they put in the system of checks and balances. And but the federal bureaucracy grew so large in the 20th century that it has usurped a lot of the power of Congress and the judicial branches. And in some cases, Congress sort of willingly went along with this. But we do see, a big part of the problem is that it's now at the point where it's very hard to fire any of the bureaucrats, which wasn't the original intent in the 1880s. They thought you could fire people, but now, because of unionization, these people almost impossible to fire, which means some of them don't work very hard, and they think they can get away with a lot of bad things. And so, the bureaucracy has, unfortunately, rightly acquired a reputation in this country for being unresponsive and self-serving.
Now, I'd like to delve a bit into your intellectual history, as you've elaborated in the beginning chapters of the book. You've stated that there was a point in your life where you were happy that Jimmy Carter won the presidential election. I think it was either in 76 or
in 1980, yeah.
Oh, right. So 1980. Right. So your school held an election, and the overwhelming majority voted for Jimmy Carter, which obviously he didn't end up winning that year. It was Reagan. And you've also stated that reading the novels of Dostoevsky changed your political outlook from left to right. So tell me more about that.
Yes, well, I was introduced to them as a high school student, and of course, I've read them again repeatedly since then, but and refined my thinking a bit. But fundamentally, the one of the critical themes in those books is the concept of personal responsibility, and that individuals have choices and they can make good choices and they can make bad choices, and some people do each. And the left tends to remove a lot of this human agency from us, and view people as victims who the state has to uphold. So that was a big part of it. I think also his concept of um, the importance of God in morality, because you see these characters who, he's writing in the 19th century, a lot of them seem like they could come out of a later period in the 20th century, but you have these intellectuals who are through renouncing God and religion, and they end up going down some very dark paths. So yeah, he's I think still my favorite author, somebody of profound um, insight into the human condition. And that's another thing, where the left and right really diverge, is this question of human nature, where the left has typically maintained that people are inherently good, and hence we can give them all sorts of authorities and not worry about it, whereas the right has been much more skeptical. And you see in Dostoevsky's work this deep penetrating analysis of the human soul and its susceptibility to bad thinking and to evil. And so we as humans need to be aware of that, and that's the only way we can actually sort of try to combat the evil that it tempts everyone.
So in your reading of his novels, how would you distinguish a good or moral character from an immoral or an amoral one?
Well, the goodness, and this is goes back to sort of more fundamental Christian theology, but they see in and I think Alyosha and Brothers Karamazov is sort of the epitome of this, but they see the image of God in other people, and so therefore they understand that they have to treat those people as they would want someone else to treat them. And you have this concept of the brotherhood of man, people loving each other because they're all children of God. And so the atheists in his books reject that presumption. And if you assume that's not true, then it's very easy to justify mass killing. And he does foreshadow what we see in the 20th century Russia, that people convince themselves that and oftentimes they think they're still doing good, but they take a utilitarian position that, well, I know what's good, and so if that means we have to kill 1 million people in the interest of greater good, then we can do that.
And moving on to your days at Harvard College, you studied under Harvey Mansfield, who is one of my favorite conservative thinkers. I actually invited him to the show once, and we had a wonderful talk. So
Oh, good.
how does he shape your thinking?
Yes, well, he in college, of all the philosophers I read, and some of them were in his classes, I really thought Aristotle stood out above the rest. And he taught on Aristotle and made it Aristotle readily understandable. And the part of Aristotle that I found most compelling, and of course anyone who's been through college knows that most of what you learn in college is you forget. But one thing from that class really stood out for me was this Aristotle's concept of morality, where he said, there's not a easy set of list that you can a checklist for moral behavior, which is what sort of moral absolutists would argue. But it's also not true that there is no sort of moral standard, as moral relativists would say. And so he argued that in any given situation, there are moral and immoral courses of action, but you've got to use your reason to understand what those are. And I found ever since, and as I got into these serious moral questions later on in life, that this was a very useful way of thinking about it, and one that certainly some Americans and some people understand, but I think there are still people who defer too much to either moral relativism, or they try to have these absolutist precepts that don't really take any sort of nuance into account.
If you compare Aristotle with Plato, who has more to inform us about our modern political condition?
Yeah, I'm inclined to think Aristotle does. I think he has a better grasp of human condition, which is much of the human condition is timeless. And Plato, in my view, is too abstract and makes too many assumptions about the goodness of humans and the prospects for better rule, and for that reason more inclined to accept sort of stronger government. So I certainly think Aristotle is the one to whom we should look for as we think about our current political lives.
Yes, I agree. Um, so you also noted that some of the faculty members in your days at Harvard and in the Texas Bush School, they were at the same time morally relativistic, but also morally absolutist. Um, how could they, in your view, square these circles?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think a lot of them just never bother to do it, and that's part of the problem you have with this what's become a one-party state essentially in academia, that people don't get questioned, and they get asked obvious questions like that. So yeah, as I explained, you hear a lot of people putting out these ideas of moral relativism when it suits their particular interests. So if they want to look at illegal immigrants stealing bread, they can find some reason for that because this person had no choice, or circumstances were thrown up upon them. We can't, and it's only the wealthy who would find this criminal. But then again, when you find a different case on issues that are of high concern to them, and they have a stake in absolutism, things like abortion, they take a very absolutist position that you've got to there's only one moral high ground, and we occupy it. And they certainly in those cases don't accept at all this idea that there could be some other alternative relative point of view that calls their view into question.
Yes, I suppose if you were to bring in a recent example, university students, I suppose from Harvard and Columbia and Berkeley, amongst others, they have everything to say in regards to Israel's conduct in Gaza, but have little to say in regards to, I suppose, Hamas's treatment to anyone who's not Muslim or male.
Yes, and there's again a lot sort of sloppiness of thinking that is allowed to proliferate in these institutions because they don't have people pointing out those sorts of contradictions to them.
Now, what is the appropriate middle ground, if there is any, between moral relativism and moral absolutism?
Yeah, well, I think it's that idea of Aristotle that there is a moral order, and there are some absolute truths to it, and fundamentally the idea that everyone is created in the image of God, and that therefore they are deserving of being treated in some way. But then having the use of reason to figure out how to apply that in given situations, because you have to think through these things. And that's another problem we've seen on our college campuses, is that people have turned their back on reason completely, and which is part of why they argue that their positions are unassailable. And reason can sometimes mislead us, but I think to simply reject it out of hand is very dangerous.
Mhm. Now, I suppose a difference between us conservative American thinkers and our liberal friends and colleagues is that we think of our founders as not merely historical figures. We think of them as first-rate political thinkers and scientists and philosophers, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas I suppose even if a given liberal respects the founders, they consider them as products of their time, and they would first mention their flaws and foibles before any of their achievements. So, how would you make the case for considering the founders as political thinkers?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it's worth noting that there are some of the more old-fashioned liberals, some of whom you still will find on college campuses, they do have some at least respect for these founders. But and now that conservatives are gone, you have those people being attacked by radicals who want to go much further and say essentially these founders were just a bunch of racist slave owners. But I think if you look based on the historical record and what these people said and what they did in their time, I think you have to be willfully blind. I think if one thing certainly we at Hillsdale require our students to read the Federalist Papers and the Constitution and other things these people read. So if you actually read what these people said and you read some reasonable histories about them, it is quite stunning how insightful they are and how they're much of what they say is stood the test of time. And of course, if you look too at our political system, the country has weathered a number of crises and in ways that most countries haven't been able to do. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the musical Hamilton. A lot of the left kind of surprised when they actually learned some things about Hamilton, and like actually this guy said some things that made a lot of sense. So I think the most Americans, if they actually read what these people did and said, will have a favorable opinion. And that's why it's so dangerous when we see textbooks out there sort of wiping away a lot of what these people said. And if we have this project, the 1619 Project, where they essentially try to ignore most of this and just focus on slavery, a few other issues, while neglecting the much more profound things that these founders had to say.
Mhm. Yes. And as far as I'm concerned, the 1619 Project is not a new phenomenon in the annals of revisionist history. A generation before, you have Howard Zinn with his book, A People's History of the United States. And a commonality that I find between all of these revisionist historians is that they would place the American founding anywhere but the actual American founding. I suppose is the year 1976. I suppose for Zinn, it would be 1492 when Columbus landed in America. And for the New York Times and Nicole Hannah-Jones, it'll be, of course, the year 1619. Mm-hmm. So I suppose there must be a case made on why we should consider the year 1776 as the year of the founding. So how would you make that case?
Yes, well, that's a great point. And Howard Zinn, when he first came out, he was kind of, even by liberals, viewed as this fringe figure. And so it's startling now to see that his book is actually used as a textbook at a lot of colleges. That's really disturbing. And one thing I point out too for your audience who may not be familiar with it, one of my Hillsdale colleagues, Bill McClay, recently wrote a book called Land of Hope, which is a much more traditionally oriented book in history of America. And it's actually not hugely different from the textbooks that I had as a student in the 1980s. But in today's time, it's a pretty sharp departure because it does focus on the good things that founders did. I should also mention Hillsdale also put something together called the 1776 Project, which goes into more detail on why it is in fact 1776 is the date we should be looking for. And I do think that is a critical period. I mean, I do think also there is some truth to the argument that a lot of people would make, historians, that while 1776 is an important turning point, the ideas that animate the American Revolution have actually been in place for decades. and they've been developing. And you can trace to some extent all the way back to the Glorious Revolution of 1689. So you had this emerging concept of self-government, limitations on power, and then, of course, too, the governments that exist from 1776 until the Constitution are somewhat different as well. And so the Constitution, I think, is also at least as important as the Declaration in terms of defining the country, because there were lots of differences. I mean, you had the anti-federalists who were fundamentally opposed to much of what we have in our Constitution. So I do think it's good to think of it as a process, and certainly the sort of the thinking of the founders, I think, is the central part in that process. And we shouldn't forget about slavery, but also should not think that slavery was the central issue or the dominant issue of our history.
Yes, you've mentioned the Federalist Papers, which is a great collection of documents, of course. I also recently read a short book by Herbert Storing of the University of Chicago, where he mentions the political thought of the anti-federalists. So these people, I believe, included Jefferson and Patrick Henry. So in your view, how did the Federalists eventually win the debate?
Well, I think they had the benefit of the first few years of the Articles of Confederation, where people could see that a extremely limited government was not able to perform some essential tasks. And this also, back to this fundamental question of human nature, the Federalists tend to have a more pessimistic view of human nature, and that view gains credence as you see some of the problems that occur. There's not a strong federal government to deal with things like insurrections or to deal with a hostile England. And so people eventually become convinced that you need a national government, not a large government, nothing like what we have today, but that there's certain key functions that you need, national defense being foremost among those. It's a hostile world, and individual states cannot defend themselves very well, and but also the national treasury, another important one. And so I think that human experience, doses of reality, ultimately are able to help them prevail. Of course, you do have some tremendously brilliant individuals, Madison and Hamilton, I think perhaps the most brilliant of them. And then they're also able to convince Washington, who is a unique figure in the history of the country, who's respected by everyone.
Right. So to what extent did the founders, and I suppose the Federalists in particular, foresee the coming of an administrative state?
Yeah, I think they probably would have been shocked. I doubt they gave too much thought to that. And one of the things that's most striking about the Constitution is when the government's originally formed, they believe that the U.S. Congress only needs to meet one time per year. So that gives you a fairly good idea of how small they expected the federal government to be. Yeah, I think it's not really until the 20th century that you see this massive upsurge in the size of the government, and whether that was inevitable or not, I think is an interesting question. But I certainly think they did not at all anticipate this challenge. What they did do was give us checks and balances that are to some extent still useful. We do see the judiciary still sometimes can assert its authority over the administrative state, and I think there are some perhaps Supreme Court decisions coming up that will further put limits on the administrative state. And they gave certain powers to Congress. Congress still has the power of the purse, and so that does give them some leverage over the administrative state. But yeah, I certainly don't think they would have envisioned sort of the massive growth of the administrative state, and particularly all the domestic policies and agencies, which in my opinion, much of that has not been very helpful anyway. But of course, you do have industrialization and urbanization taking place that they probably didn't foresee, which to some extent accounts for the growth of the federal government.
Yes. Of course, the Constitution of the United States guarantees two levels of separation of powers, one between the federal government and the local governments, but secondly, of the three branches of the federal government, executive, legislative, and judiciary. Um, to what extent is that system still works to this day? Are the three powers, three branches too strong or too weak to check and balance one another?
Yeah, well, I think certainly can make the case that the federal government has become too strong relative to state and local governments, and perhaps state too strong relative to local government. In my community, people tend to think the state government sticks its nose into too many things, but the federal government, I think, is really the bigger problem in terms of how large it's grown. Local communities still do have some authority, but I think in general, government tends to work better the closer it is to the people because they have a stake, they can see what's going on. So I do think too much federal authority has too much power has been concentrated in the federal government. In terms of the branches, I think the executive branch has in recent times become more powerful than it should be. The last time we really saw a strong Congress was in the 1970s. And in that case, it maybe was a bit of an overcorrection in the wake of Watergate. Congress was pushing the executive branch around. But now we're in a situation where the executive branch is too often, I think, pushing Congress around. And in fact, in my experience in the book, I talk about this where Congress was trying to get information about my case from the executive branch, and the executive branch came up with lots of excuses as to why they were not going to do that. We've also seen this just very recently in the case of Merrick Garland, where he's refusing this congressional subpoena. And even though he himself had, and this is also gets back to the two-tier justice system, he prosecuted Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro for ignoring congressional subpoenas. But here you have the executive branch telling Congress, essentially, we don't have to do what you probably are entitled to do.
Okay. So recently, Dr. Fauci has released a memoir, and throughout the COVID times, I see him as a symptom, so to speak, of the entrenchment of the bureaucratic power within the federal government. It appears to me, at least, that all COVID policies run through him, and I think in some interview or other, he seems to fashion himself as the authority on COVID matters, which is a total disruption of what constitutional democratic government should be. Well, Fauci is one expert, but he's one amongst many, and experts do contradict and disagree with one another, as well as they have the obligation to inform our legislators about medical policies, COVID in particular, but at the end of the day, the final decision is of our elected legislators and not theirs. So, yeah, tell me more about your observations regarding Dr. Fauci and COVID.
He does represent sort of a ideal bad example of these bureaucrats who are, some people claim, are impartial and beyond reproach. And I think the mainstream media kind of fed this. And whenever someone questioned Dr. Fauci, they and Fauci claimed that, no, the science, as if there was some uniform science that could always be relied on, that the science was what Dr. Fauci was about, and other people were not science. And we now know, and he's even admitted that he was wrong about some of these things. And we saw rather stunningly recently this official close to him talking about how they could conceal or destroy all of these email records. Really one of the more astonishing testimonies we've seen before Congress in a long time. And it is part of this hubris that goes back to Woodrow Wilson, that these experts somehow know better than everybody else, even on these very controversial topics. Deborah Birx has also talked about, she's another example, and she talks about deliberately sort of avoiding or doing what Trump, the elected official Trump, wanted to do. And again, we've seen that policies they said were going to be good, like masking and social distancing, didn't actually achieve the results. And we also think disturbingly saw that other members of the scientific community who differed with them, some very distinguished physicians, medical experts, they deliberately tried to sideline these people, suppress their views, sabotage their careers. And so I think hopefully people have learned from the Dr. Fauci experience that even the most supposedly eminent experts should not be viewed as infallible, and that the people should just blindly follow what they say.
Mhm. Yes, and it's worth remembering also that Dr. Fauci was an appointee of Trump. And of course, Trump entered the 2016 presidential race, promising to drain the swamp. So it may come up as a inconsistency on President Donald's end. So I wonder, um, how could he have done this differently? Should Donald Trump have hired or appointed a committee of scientists and physicians rather than just put all the power to regulate COVID policies on one man?
Well, I think it's symptomatic of a broader problem that explains why he wasn't able to drain the swamp in the way he promised. When Trump was elected, neither he nor anyone else really expected that he was going to win the election. And so there hadn't been much preparation for the administration. And it wasn't until after the election that they started paying more attention to Chris Christie, who had been the person in charge of staffing the new administration. And then they looked at what he'd been doing, and they found that they had all of these establishment figures who, in many cases, were not really on board with what Trump wanted. So they got rid of Christie, and they had to start at square one. But the day after the election is not when you should be trying to staff these agencies. So they had to do this very quickly. And I think everyone, including Trump himself, recognizes that some mistakes were made, some serious mistakes in personnel. Fauci is an obvious example. Rex Tillerson at the State Department, James Mattis at the Defense Department. Said this number 2 woman at my agency, Bonnie Glick, they ended up firing her, but not till late in 2020 when it's really not till 2020 that the Presidential Personnel Office gets its act together. And so you see in 2020, they start finally cleaning house. But clearly a lack of preparation, not knowing really enough about these senior appointments. And so that is one thing that is being done effectively right now. You have the America First Policy Institute and the Heritage Foundation both have major initiatives to identify leaders for a second Trump term. And so I think you'll see a lot better personnel selection, because if you don't have the right personnel, as they say, personnel is policy, you're not going to get things done at the federal agencies if you don't have the right people there.
Well, this is debate amongst even conservatives too, that say if Donald Trump is elected in 2024, he has to pick between loyalists who are friendly towards Trump between 2016 and 2020 and so on, and those who are competent at their jobs. And I suppose a conflict is some people like Attorney General Barr or Vice President Pence, who are competent people, may not want to be on board in Trump 2024. So how would the next Trump administration look like in this regard?
Yeah, well, I think ideally you want people who are both loyal and competent, and I do think there's a good number of those people. There are some competent people who, I think people who have come out openly attacked Trump. Some of them actually have later thought, well, why didn't they hire me? But if you're going to go out and really slam the president, it doesn't really make sense for you to be hired into administration anyway. But there are, certainly there's a danger of people who are seen as very loyal getting promoted into jobs that are beyond their capabilities. And we've seen this, of course, too, in Biden administration and every other administration, really. You do need, certain positions, you need people who you can be convinced of their loyalty. But I think people are making too much of this, especially the political opponents of Trump, and trying to make it seem like that he's Darth Vader and only going to bring in the bootlicking fascists to help him. There's plenty of good people who support what he wants to do and have competence in the areas that are of most importance.
I'm not sure to what extent are you a fan of the television show The West Wing, but I believe the motto of I guess President Bartlett's cabinet in that show is that you appoint people, good, talented people who disagree with you, as in the president. I wonder if that, to what extent is that applied in real life?
Yeah, I mean, you do see some of that. I think it can become pretty problematic, and we've seen this before. Henry Kissinger did that when he came into office, but then you saw, he would bring in the liberal Democrats who were still kind of willing to work in a Republican administration, but soon you started to have a lot of leaks coming out of the White House and things making the president look bad. And of course, we saw a lot of links in the Trump White House and from people who didn't support the president. So I think it's going to be difficult to do. I mean, you want people who are independent minded, but I think, especially given how polarized the parties are and how much contempt there is for Trump right now, I think it'd probably be difficult to find people who actually really very much opposed to the president and yet are going to do what he wants, because especially he's going to do a lot of things that are quite unpopular with his opponents, like dealing with illegal immigration, for example. He's going to have some tough policies on that, and a lot of his opponents, I think, are going to be very opposed to what he does. Even though we've seen, there's a recent poll, 62% of Americans support mass deportation, which is actually quite stunning. But you'll have a lot of people in Washington on the left who kind of do whatever they can to stop something like that from happening.
Now, I'd like to focus on the two impeachment trials of Trump. The first one, I still find it difficult to wrap my head around. I think years from now, if are there any like good historians out there, they should look into how the I guess Trump-Russia collusion scandal was propped up and then resulted in almost nothing. So yeah, and of course, it all culminated in Trump dealing with two figures that we hear on the news quite frequently now, President Zelensky of Ukraine, and of course, President Biden's son, Hunter. What did you make of that first impeachment trial then? And of course, now, when you think about it.
Yeah, well, as you said, from even before he took office, there were all these people out to get Trump, and it started with Crossfire Hurricane, which is a scandal that definitely doesn't get the attention it deserves, especially from the left side of the political spectrum. A lot of them start kind of living in denial about this, but people like Kevin Kleinsmith go to jail. You have Bruce Orr and Andrew McCabe getting fired from the FBI. So this wasn't just some made up thing. You have Steele dossier funded by Hillary Clinton used to spy on a presidential campaign. That's a very big deal. And then this morphs into the Mueller probe, and you have Adam Schiff out there telling everyone, oh, there's all this damning evidence. And then but then the Mueller report comes out and actually, no, there isn't anything here. So then you have people like Adam Schiff saying, well, we're going to find some new thing to go after Trump with this Ukraine phone call, which also, again, is very flimsy sort of claim. And of course, even Republicans who didn't care for Trump see through this as kind of a charade. And they oppose that too. But these things become useful to the Democrats in tying the president up, sucking up his time, taking him away from doing the things he really wants to do. And then the second impeachment, they go ahead, and that's also really a show trial, and they know it's not going to even make sense because he was out of office before it could be even completed. And this does set precedents for more of this of witch hunting, lawfare. You see the Republicans going after Joe and Hunter Biden now. I do think there is more there in their cases, especially when it comes to selling influence. I think Peter Schweitzer has shown that Biden's got over $30 million from various Chinese entities, and that clearly there was vice president when Biden was vice president, he was using his influence to accumulate wealth. But I do think too, if we see a second Trump term, you're going to see yet new efforts to try to tie him up in legal knots.
Mhm. Yes, in regards to the second trial, it's always very funny because to me at least, because how what happened in January the 6th, 2021, it was a legitimate disruption of constitutional procedures, but to call it an insurrection and a coup is something quite laughable because it would be the first time in world history that a sitting leader staged a coup against, well, himself or his government.
Yes, yeah, that idea. I mean, that was another effort by the left to kind of manipulate language to their advantage. But the idea this was an insurrection first begs a question of who was actually behind this, and they try to tie this to Trump, but then it looks like there are these outside groups that aren't really connected to him. Of course, I think it probably also be the first time you have an insurrection, a coup, where it stopped without any bloodshed, except for the only person killed was actually a person who was trying to enter the Capitol, and obviously unfortunate what happened, and some people were resorting to violence when they should have. But we also saw these Black Lives Matter protests where people were breaking, entering, and burning things down, and yet the same standards of justice were not applied to them. Very few of them were prosecuted in the way that the Biden Justice Department has gone after people who whose sole crime was sort of walking near or into the Capitol while this was going on.
Now, another difference, I think, between the Trump and Biden administrations is that the former seems to forego or bypass the bureaucratic red tape, so to speak, to conduct foreign policy. And that was very controversial in the Trump years, although he did manage to succeed in regards to fostering peace with Israel and several Arab countries. Whereas the allegations or the charges I hear from the Biden administration is that they continue to rely on this bureaucracy to conduct foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. Of course, talks of restoring the nuclear arms deal with Iran is rumored to be taking place once again. So yeah, tell me more about how I guess too much bureaucracy can influence or interfere with foreign policy practices.
Well, the State Department has always been one of the worst bureaucracies when we think of the worst elements of bureaucracy. And they like to spend a lot of time looking at problems without necessarily coming up with solutions. And they also like to spend a great deal of time negotiating, and negotiating kind of comes an end in itself rather than an end to a means. And so you saw in the Trump administration, basically most of the State Department was cut out of the loop. And this isn't the first time it's happened. Nixon did essentially the same thing to the State Department. And usually bureaucracy, if it does try to come up with policies, it tends to rely on conventional wisdom, takes forever to get anything done. We see that also in the Defense Department under this administration. you get not a lot of original thinking. In terms of how policies be controlled, I think that's still a bit unclear ultimately. I mean, you have the president seems to be very weak and feeble, and we see in other instances, I mean, if you look at the border, he is allowing a fairly radical policy of letting all these people in, which runs contrary to most of what he ran on earlier in his career. And so it does raise the question of who really is making decisions there. And I think it's an outstanding question. I mean, eventually historians will find out, and we'll get meeting notes from a lot of the discussions that took place. But right now, it does seem to be kind of uncertain as to really who is calling shots on a lot of these issues.
I'd like to end on this note. So in our previous discussion, we talked about the Vietnam War, namely your revisionist history of it. I believe General H.R. McMaster, when he was a major, McMaster, he authored a book on how Johnson and McNamara deceived the public in regards to how the Vietnam War was going. I believe the title is Dereliction of Duty. Yes. He mentions that there was a battle within the Johnson administration in regards to the military officers and the civil servants. So McNamara was one of the civil servants in regards to how the war is being played out. And McNamara, in his rationalist approach, dominated the strategy making, and thus, I guess, was not competent in leading the war to its success. Whereas if the military leaders, with their years of experience, was able to get more control, the war could have ended with a happier ending. So I wonder, to what extent would you find that agreeable?
Yeah, I do tend to agree with that interpretation. And in fact, there's a new book out called The Makers of Modern Strategy, which I had a chapter in there on Lyndon Johnson and McNamara. And it is correct. Essentially, they drew, McNamara in particular was influenced by these academic theories that were based on abstract assumptions about human reason, and that basically taking from economics the idea of a rational actor, and we can foresee how a rational actor is going to react under a set of circumstances. And so this informs a lot of their early efforts to try to contain the conflict. They engage in what we call pinprick actions, believing that they're sending a message to the other side of resolve, but instead they send a message of weakness. And so this then encourages the North Vietnamese to move ahead with their go for broke offensive in 1965. And so yeah, I think it's a very important cautionary tale about avoiding wishful thinking and avoiding assuming we can predict with certainty how an adversary is going to act. And also it just demonstrates how overwhelming force or the threat of it tends to be more effective than trying to use very limited shows of force.
I think that's a very good note to end on. Thank you very much once again, Mark Moyar, for joining this program.